The 14th of May, 1940, dawned cold and gray over the English Channel, and with it came news that turned Britain's blood to ice. German panzers had smashed through the Ardennes forest, ripping apart French defenses that military experts had promised were impregnable. Within hours, the wireless crackled with reports that sent shockwaves through every village, town, and city across the British Isles. The Wehrmacht was racing toward the coast, and nothing seemed capable of stopping them. In London's War Office, generals stared at maps with growing horror as the colored pins marking Allied positions retreated day by day, hour by hour, toward the sea. Winston Churchill, barely 2 weeks into his premiership, stood before the House of Commons and spoke words that would define a generation. "I'd have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he declared, his voice gravelly with determination. But beyond the stirring rhetoric, Britain faced a terrifying reality, and France fell and intelligence suggested it would fall soon. The nation would stand alone against Adolf Hitler's war machine. The British Expeditionary Force, the country's professional army, was trapped on the continent. The Royal Navy commanded the seas, but seas could be crossed, and Britain's shores stretched for thousands of miles. Impossible to defend with conventional forces alone. In Berlin, German military planners were already drafting Operation Sea Lion, the code name for the invasion of Britain. Wehrmacht officers studied aerial reconnaissance photographs and coastal surveys, identifying beaches suitable for landing craft, roads strong enough for tanks, and terrain favorable for rapid advance inland. The German High Command's assessment was coldly professional. British forces were scattered and demoralized, their best troops either dead in Flanders or awaiting evacuation at Dunkirk. Intelligence reports suggested that fewer than 15 divisions defended the entire island, barely enough to guard London, let alone the hundreds of potential landing sites along the southern and eastern coasts. According to documents later captured and referenced in historian Norman Longmaid's comprehensive work The Real Dad's Army, German planners expected to encounter a nation in chaos, with civilians fleeing inland and local authorities paralyzed by panic. They could not have been more wrong. On the 19th of May, 1940, even as the Dunkirk evacuation was still being planned, Secretary of State for War Anthony Eden made an announcement that would change everything. Speaking on the BBC Home Service, Eden called for men aged 17 to 65 who were not already in military service to come forward and form a new force. This volunteer army would be called the Local Defense Volunteers, a name soon changed to the Home Guard, and its mission was straightforward: defend Britain against airborne assault and prepare for the possibility of invasion. Eden expected perhaps 150,000 volunteers. Within 24 hours, 250,000 men had mobbed recruiting stations across the country. By the end of the first week, over 750,000 had volunteered. By summer's end, the number exceeded 1.5 million, the largest volunteer army Britain had ever raised, and they were ready to fight with whatever weapons they could find. The 23rd of May, 1940, saw queues stretching around city blocks at police stations, town halls, and makeshift recruiting centers throughout Britain. Men arrived wearing their work clothes, factory overalls, farmers' tweeds, shopkeepers' aprons, clutching whatever they believed might serve as weapons. They brought shotguns inherited from grandfathers, sporting rifles used for hunting deer on Scottish estates, antique pistols from the Great War carefully oiled and hidden in attic trunks for 2 decades. Some carried pitchforks and scythes, garden tools, and cricket bats, anything that might injure a German paratrooper. The enthusiasm was overwhelming. The equipment was catastrophically inadequate, according to records preserved in the Imperial War Museum and detailed in SP. Mackenzie's scholarly study, The Home Guard, a military and political history, the War Office initially regarded these improvised forces with a mixture of gratitude and horror. Professional soldiers worried that untrained civilians would cause more casualties to themselves than to any invaders. But Churchill recognized something the generals initially missed. These men represented something far more valuable than military capability alone. The 9th of June, 1940, brought news that made invasion seem inevitable. Norway had fallen, and France was collapsing. German forces had reached the Seine. British strategists now worked from the assumption that they had weeks, perhaps only days, before German landing craft appeared on the horizon. The question was no longer if invasion would come, but where and whether Britain could possibly survive it. The Home Guard's deployment reflected the brutal mathematics of coastal defense. The southeastern counties, Kent, Sussex, Essex, Suffolk, became fortified zones where Home Guard units dug in with desperate intensity. Every village organized its own platoon, every town its own company. They knew the terrain intimately. The farmers knew which fields turned to mud after rain, rendering them impassable for tanks. The fishermen knew which beaches had treacherous undertows that would drown landing craft. The postman knew every lane and shortcut, information that would prove invaluable for ambushes and guerrilla warfare. Major General Harold Franklin, commanding the defense of southern England, developed a strategy that depended heavily on the Home Guard. Regular army units, precious and few, would form a mobile reserve to counterattack wherever the Germans established a beachhead. But the Home Guard would provide the crucial first hours of resistance. They would fight delaying actions, destroy bridges, fell trees across roads, and generally create the chaos that would slow the German advance, just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it was a strategy nonetheless. The invasion plans captured after the war, now housed in the National Archives and extensively analyzed in Peter Fleming's Operation Sea Lion, reveal just how catastrophically the Germans underestimated what awaited them. Wehrmacht intelligence had identified the Home Guard, but dismissed them as negligible. One German assessment described them as elderly men playing as soldiers, armed with hunting rifles and antique weapons, without training or discipline, likely to flee at the first sight of professional troops. The report concluded that Home Guard units could be safely ignored in invasion planning, their combat effectiveness rated at essentially zero. This assessment failed to account for several crucial factors. First, these elderly men included hundreds of thousands of Great War veterans who had survived the Somme, Passchendaele, and Gallipoli. They knew what modern warfare looked like, understood how to dig proper defensive positions, and had no illusions about combat. Second, the Home Guard controlled the very terrain the Germans would need to traverse. Every bridge, every crossroads, every village green was familiar ground to the defenders and unknown territory to the invaders. Third, and perhaps most important, these men were not fighting for abstract concepts of empire or ideology. They were defending their homes. The baker in the Home Guard platoon was literally defending his bakery, the farmer his fields, the shopkeeper his shop. When German planners assumed these forces would flee or surrender, they fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of home defense. These men had nowhere to flee to. Behind them were their wives, their children, their entire lives. Surrender meant occupation, and everyone had heard the stories from Poland and France about what occupation meant. By mid-June, the Home Guard numbered over 1 million men, organized into approximately 1,500 battalions. They still lacked sufficient rifles, fewer than half had firearms of any kind, but they had begun receiving training from regular army instructors who taught them the fundamentals: how to construct field fortifications, how to organize defensive fire, how to make every bullet count. The 23rd of July, 1940, saw the first significant shipment of rifles reach Home Guard units, and with it came a revelation of just how desperate Britain's situation truly was. The weapons were American 300,000 Pattern 14 rifles and 300,000 M1917 Enfield rifles, purchased from American arsenals and shipped across the U-boat-infested Atlantic. They were Great War vintage, many showing rust and wear from decades in storage. But they were real military rifles with real ammunition. And two men who had been drilling with broomsticks, they were treasures beyond measure. Colonel Thomas Winteringham, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who had written extensively on guerrilla warfare, was recruited to train Home Guard officers in unconventional tactics. Winteringham understood something that traditional British officers often missed. The Home Guard would never win a conventional battle against Wehrmacht troops. But they did not need to. Their role was to disrupt, delay, and deny to turn every mile of British countryside into a nightmare for invaders. At training schools established in country estates across England, Winteringham taught Home Guard officers how to construct booby traps, how to organize ambushes, how to maximize casualties while minimizing their own exposure. The curriculum was grimly practical. Home Guard units learned to identify the weak points in German tanks, the tracks, the vision ports, the engine vents, and practiced approaching armor through dead ground and cover. They had learned to construct Molotov cocktails from whiskey bottles and petrol, creating weapons that cost virtually nothing but could brew up a panzer if thrown accurately. They learned to shoot and move, to use buildings and hedgerows for cover, to retreat through prepared positions, rather than standing and dying pointlessly. Not all Home Guard units received the same level of training or equipment. The disparities were shocking. Units near London and the invasion coast received priority for weapons and instruction. Units in Scotland, Wales, and northern England often remained equipped with shotguns and improvised weapons well into late 1940. One unit in Cumberland drilled with pikes, actual medieval pikes manufactured by the local blacksmith because nothing else was available. Their commander, a retired colonel named Jeffrey Norton, reportedly told his men, "If Jerry comes here, we'll fight him like our ancestors fought at Bannockburn because we've got similar weapons." The weapons shortage led to one of the war's stranger episodes, the American appeal for firearms. Through newspaper advertisements and radio broadcasts, the British government appealed to American civilians to donate hunting rifles and sporting weapons. The response was overwhelming. Americans sent over 20,000 rifles, thousands of pistols, and even some antique weapons dating back to the American Civil War. According to accounts preserved in the Churchill Archives Center and referenced in historian David Carroll's The Home Guard and the Defense of Britain, one British Home Guard unit received a lever-action Winchester rifle with a note attached. "This killed my first deer in Montana in 1903. I hope it kills your first German." The arrival of weapons changed the Home Guard psychology. Men who had felt foolish marching with broomsticks now carried real rifles, wore increasingly uniform equipment, and trained with live ammunition. Casualties from training accidents began to mount. Men unaccustomed to handling military weapons made predictable mistakes, but morale soared. For the first time, Home Guard units began to believe they might actually be able to inflict serious damage on invaders. Throughout August and September 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead and RAF pilots fought desperately to prevent German air superiority, the Home Guard continued their preparations. They laid landmines along beaches, stretched barbed wire across fields, constructed concrete pillboxes at strategic crossroads. They practiced night operations because invasion would most likely come at night. They rehearsed their withdrawal routes and prepositioned ammunition caches in barns and churches. The 7th of September, 1940, marked the beginning of the Blitz, the sustained German bombing campaign against British cities. London burned as hundreds of Luftwaffe bombers dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The East End suffered catastrophic damage, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, thousands killed. But this aerial assault, horrific as it was, also revealed something crucial. Invasion was not imminent. German strategy had shifted from preparing for Sea Lion to attempting to bomb Britain into submission. The Home Guard, braced for imminent invasion throughout the summer, faced a different reality. They were needed for civil defense, not coastal defense. Home Guard units adapted quickly. In bombed cities, they provided crucial services during and after raids. They fought fires, dug survivors from collapsed buildings, maintained order in devastated neighborhoods, and hunted for unexploded bombs. This was not the warfare they had trained for, but it was warfare nonetheless. In London's East End, a Home Guard unit commanded by Albert Williams, a dock worker in civilian life, became famous for their efficiency in rescue operations. Williams' men knew the narrow streets and crowded tenements intimately, could navigate debris-choked roads in total darkness, and save countless lives during the worst nights of the Blitz. But coastal units maintained their vigilance. Intelligence reports suggested invasion remained possible through autumn, with operations perhaps planned for October, when weather might ground the RAF, but still permit channel crossings. German forces remained massed in French ports. Barges and landing craft continued to accumulate. RAF reconnaissance flights photographed the invasion fleet with meticulous detail, and those photographs were distributed to coastal Home Guard units with instructions. "This is what you will see if they come. Be ready." The waiting was psychologically exhausting. Home Guard members maintained civilian jobs while serving their military duties, which meant working full shifts at factories or farms, then reporting for guard duty or patrol. Sleep deprivation became chronic. Men nodded off at their posts, jerked awake by the cold wind off the channel, scanning the dark waters for signs of approaching landing craft. False alarms were frequent. Fishing boats misidentified, RAF exercises mistaken for German aircraft, even natural phenomena triggering invasion alerts. On the night of the 7th of September, coinciding with the first major Blitz raid on London, invasion alerts were triggered along the southern coast. Church bells rang the prearranged signal that German forces had landed. Home Guard units raced to their battle positions. Roadblocks were closed, bridges prepared for demolition, and men crouched in their trenches and pillboxes, fingers on triggers, waiting for the enemy to appear. Hours passed in tension so acute that some men vomited from stress. Then dawn came, revealing NPCs. It had been a false alarm, triggered by a confused local commander misinterpreting orders. But the response demonstrated that the Home Guard was ready, that the system worked, that Britain could mobilize its civilian defenders within minutes. But perhaps most significantly, German intelligence had finally begun to grasp the scale of Britain's defensive preparations. Aerial reconnaissance revealed fortifications far more extensive than previously believed. Agents' reports, many fabricated by British counterintelligence, as part of elaborate deception operations, described a home guard force of nearly 2 million men, well-armed and highly motivated. Whether these reports were accurate mattered less than the fact that German planners believed them. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in weeks and France in months by exploiting chaos and disorganization. Britain offered neither chaos nor disorganization. Instead, it promised a grinding, bloody campaign against an enemy fighting for their homeland. The Home Guard knew none of this. They maintained their vigil through September, October, and into November. Autumn brought shorter days and longer nights, making guard duty even more miserable. Rain turned defensive positions into mud-filled trenches reminiscent of the Western Front. Men developed trench foot, pneumonia, and chronic exhaustion. Some units reported that half their members were perpetually sick, yet they remained at their posts because invasion still seemed possible, even probable. The winter of 1940 to 1941 brought a gradual realization that immediate invasion was unlikely. Weather made channel crossings extremely hazardous. German attention shifted eastward. Intelligence suggested Hitler was planning operations against the Soviet Union. The Home Guard's role began to evolve. With invasion less imminent, the War Office began integrating Home Guard units into more sophisticated defense plans. They received better weapons, including anti-tank rifles and light machine guns. Training became more professional, with regular Army instructors working with units for weeks at a time, rather than conducting brief visits. Some Home Guard units developed unexpected specializations. In industrial areas, units learned to defend factories and power stations against sabotage or airborne assault. In port cities, they guarded against possible commando raids. In rural areas, they became skilled at counterinsurgency operations, preparing to fight German forces if small enemy units were landed by parachute or submarine. One unit in Cornwall became expert in coastal observation, developing such acute skills at identifying ships and aircraft that naval intelligence began relying on their reports. The social impact of the Home Guard extended far beyond military considerations. In an era when class distinctions remained rigid in British society, the Home Guard brought together men from wildly different backgrounds. Factory owners served alongside their workers, lords drilled beside laborers, university professors took orders from former non-commissioned officers whose formal education had ended at age 14. The shared purpose of defending Britain created bonds that would have been impossible in peacetime. It was not quite the social revolution some hoped for. Officers still tended to come from middle and upper classes, but it represented a significant democratization of British military culture. Women's contributions to the Home Guard remained officially unrecognized but practically essential. While not permitted to join the Home Guard itself, women organized auxiliary services that made Home Guard operations possible. They ran communications networks, operated first aid stations, provided food and hot tea for men on night duty, and maintained equipment. Some women received weapons training unofficially and stood ready to fight if invasion came. The rigid gender boundaries of the era prevented official recognition of these contributions, but without them, the Home Guard would have been far less effective. The spring of 1941 saw the Home Guard's reputation transform from music hall joke to respected military organization. Early in their existence, the press had treated them with affectionate condescension. Cartoons showed elderly men with shotguns chasing imaginary Germans. Stories circulated about comical training accidents and bureaucratic absurdities. The BBC radio program Is That Man Again featured recurring sketches mocking Home Guard pomposity and incompetence. The public laughed along, viewing the Home Guard as well-meaning but essentially amateur. Then came the demonstrations. Throughout April and May, Home Guard units conducted public exercises showcasing their capabilities. In Hyde Park, a Home Guard battalion demonstrated street fighting techniques, showing how they would contest every building and intersection if London were invaded. Using live ammunition and explosive charges, they demolished a mock building with terrifying efficiency while thousands of spectators watched. In the countryside, units demonstrated how they would ambush German armor, using concealed positions and concentrated fire to simulate destroying tanks. These were not parade ground displays, but realistic combat demonstrations, and they impressed both military observers and the general public. The professionalization continued with improved equipment. By mid-1941, most Home Guard members had proper uniforms, military boots, and steel helmets. They carried Lee-Enfield rifles, the same weapon used by regular British infantry. Some units received Thompson submachine guns, American Tommy guns, that provided devastating close-range firepower. Anti-tank weapons arrived, including the Boys anti-tank rifle, capable of penetrating light armor, and later, the American bazooka and British Pied rocket launchers. Home Guard units near potential landing sites received artillery, mostly old field guns from the Great War, but guns nonetheless, manned by veterans who remembered how to use them. Training evolved from basic drill to sophisticated tactical exercises. Home Guard battalions conducted multi-day operations simulating invasion scenarios. One notable exercise in Kent involved 500 Home Guard members defending against regular Army units playing the role of German invaders. The Home Guard, using their intimate knowledge of local terrain and employing guerrilla tactics, inflicted such heavy simulated casualties on the Germans that the regular Army officers leading the exercise filed reports recommending significant changes to invasion defense planning. According to files maintained at the Imperial War Museum and referenced in historian David Lamb's The Last Ditch, these exercises proved that well-positioned Home Guard forces could indeed significantly impede professional military units. The relationship between Home Guard and regular Army improved markedly. Initially, many professional soldiers had viewed Home Guard members with condescension or outright disdain, seeing them as civilians playing dress-up. But as Home Guard capabilities increased and as the organization took over routine duties like guarding installations and patrolling coasts, regular soldiers recognized their value. More importantly, regular units knew that if invasion came, these Home Guard battalions would be fighting and dying to buy time for mobile reserves to counterattack. That earned respect. Not all problems were solved. Tensions sometimes flared between Home Guard and regular Army over resources, authority, and recognition. The Home Guard remained unpaid volunteers while regular soldiers received wages, creating resentment. Home Guard members could not be court-martialed for violations of military discipline, leading to complaints that they lacked proper military accountability. Equipment distribution remained uneven, with favored units receiving modern weapons while others made do with obsolete rifles. The autumn of 1944 brought a peculiar realization to Britain's Home Guard. They had spent for years preparing for an invasion that would never come. In France, Allied armies were driving toward Germany. The Luftwaffe was a shattered force. German troops who had once massed in French ports for invasion were now dying in Russia, or retreating in Italy. The threat that had called the Home Guard into existence had evaporated, and with it, their original purpose. Consider the counterfactual. What would have happened if Britain had faced German invasion with only its regular military forces? In June 1940, Britain had fewer than 20 divisions on home soil, many under strength and poorly equipped after Dunkirk. These forces could not possibly have defended the entire British coastline. German planners would have identified lightly defended sectors, concentrated their invasion there, and achieved rapid breakthrough. The Home Guard's existence meant that no sector was truly undefended. Every beach, every village, every crossroad had armed men who knew the ground and were prepared to fight. This transformed the invasion calculus from difficult to possibly impossible. The strategic impact extended beyond deterrence. The Home Guard freed up hundreds of thousands of regular soldiers for frontline service elsewhere. Because the Home Guard guarded factories, bridges, airfields, and other vital infrastructure, regular units could deploy to North Africa, Italy, and later Normandy. Britain fought a global war while maintaining credible home defense only because the Home Guard existed. According to estimates compiled by military historians and referenced in SP Mackenzie's The Home Guard, a military and political history, the Home Guard's garrison duties allowed the deployment of approximately 12 additional divisions to combat theaters between 1941 and 1944, a contribution equivalent to doubling Britain's mobile military strength. The social legacy proved equally significant. The Home Guard had brought together men from every social class and occupation, united in common purpose. The bonds formed during those anxious years outlasted the organization itself. Veterans associations kept Home Guard units alive in memory, holding annual reunions for decades after the war. The experience of serving alongside people from different backgrounds subtly eroded some of Britain's rigid class barriers, contributing to the social changes that would accelerate after the war. The final parade on the 3rd of December, 1944, saw Home Guard units marching through London as His Majesty King George VI took the salute. They marched in their worn uniforms, carrying their rifles, wearing their steel helmets, looking every inch like proper soldiers which, despite never firing a shot in anger at German invaders, they had become. The King's message to the Home Guard, read aloud during the ceremony, Acknowledge their unique service. You have not fought the enemy in pitched battle, but you have freed others to do so. You have stood guard over your homeland, and because you stood ready, the enemy never dared to come. In 1940, when France fell and Britain stood alone, German planners had expected to find chaos, panic, and an easy conquest. Instead, they would have encountered over 1.5 million men, many of them Great War veterans, armed with rifles, shotguns, and sheer bloody-minded determination, defending ground they knew intimately and would not yield without horrific cost. Whether that would have been enough to stop a German invasion remains unknowable. The invasion never came, and that absence stands as perhaps the ultimate testament to the Home Guard's effectiveness. The pitchforks and shotguns of legend, laughable weapons for modern warfare, represented something far more important than their military utility. They symbolized a nation refusing to surrender, a people prepared to fight with whatever weapons came to hand rather than accept occupation. The German Wehrmacht, which had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in a stunning parade of military victories, looked across the Channel at Britain and chose not to attack. Many factors influenced that decision: the Royal Navy's power, the RAF's resistance, the logistical challenges of amphibious invasion, but among them was the certain knowledge that if German soldiers landed on British beaches, they would face not chaos and panic, but an armed, organized, and utterly determined civilian population prepared to contest every yard of British soil. The Home Guard ensured that conquest of Britain would not be a parade, but a bloodbath.